a little bit of, oh my goodness, there we go. So for this video, we're going to talk a little bit about ways of classifying culture, ways of understanding it. And we're going to start, first of all, with the material and non-material culture distinctions. But when we talk about that, I want you guys to understand that these are not separate categories. They're analytic pieces. They're pieces we use to talk about and understand culture. But in practice, okay, they're not all that distinct, okay? So when we talk about material culture, we're talking about the objects, right? The physical things that we can sort of touch and feel. And when we talk about non-material culture, we're talking about ideas and practices and ways of behaving and belonging. And we often talk about them like they're separate things. And so you have material culture on one side and non-material culture on the other side. And that's really simple and really tempting, and it's wrong. And the best example I can give you that is probably going to be pretty accessible for most of you is, think about the scene in The Little Mermaid where Ariel has this collection, the Disney version in particular, has this collection of objects from shipwrecks. And she has all of the objects. She has the material culture, but because she's a mermaid, she doesn't have the sort of non-material culture that goes along with it. So you'll have this moment where she's been interacting with forks, for example, for a really long time. But when she picks one up with at the dinner table, she uses it to comb her hair because she doesn't have an idea this is for eating. So when we talk about this in practice, like in actual people's real worlds, the material and the non-material actually sort of intertwine in some really interesting ways, because we need the ideas to go along with how one uses a piece of material culture, for example, what that's for. And also, like, our non-material cultures, ideas about values, ideas about what's important, about how relationships need to be maintained, are going to impact the kinds of objects that we create, right? So, for example, if we're also going to continue talking about cutlery and utensils for eating, in cultures like those sort of common in Europe and then spread to North America through colonization, there was a cultural idea, a non-material idea, that civilization meant not touching one's food with one's hands. So Western cultures created forks and knives and spoons for use at the table. Whereas in cultures where that is not the case, where that piece of non-material culture is missing, they have solved similar problems, right, about how does one get food to one's mouth while eating with other people, in different ways. So, for example, you've got injera in Ethiopian food, you've got the use of pita bread in Lebanese Mediterranean cuisine. There's lots of cases where people do eat with their hands, and they use sort of forms of bread, essentially, to pick up food rather than knives and forks. So when we talk about non-material culture and material culture, practically, they are really, really deeply intertwined. So that is an important part of that. The other classification that we often use in sort of understanding culture is high culture and popular culture. Sometimes also described as high and low, although your textbook uses popular, so we'll use that. And one of the things that I want you guys to understand when we start talking about these classifications is that those labels are not mutually exclusive. So, for example, when we talk about high culture, and this is a piece that I really need you to understand, high culture contains both material and non-material elements. So your book talks, for example, about status symbols. So you can talk about the fancy cars and the expensive designer clothes and the second homes and the jets. Like, you can talk about those things as examples of high culture. But Pierre Bourdieu, who created and sort of developed the concept, his initial interest wasn't actually in that kind of thing at all. His interest in that sort of space of high culture was almost entirely in the non-material realm. So he talks about an example like table manners, right? The idea of being able to walk into a restaurant or a meal where there are 4 forks on the table and 3 spoons, and knowing which one to pick up when to eat what, right? That's not a material object at all. That's a non-material piece. It's a piece of culture and ideas about that. So he will also give sort of examples about knowing what neighborhood, like what schools are good for what things and what outcomes, having a knowledge of the ballet, of the opera, of classical music, all of these things that are not necessarily objects, but are practices and ideas and pieces of non-material culture in terms of values, in terms of how one spends one's time, in terms of behaviors that are thought to, I won't sort of claim that this does or doesn't, but are thought to mark membership among a society's elite. Okay, so that's what we talk about in terms of high culture, and I will also, but I want you guys to understand that popular culture also includes those same pieces. It includes material aspects and non-material aspects, right? There's some conversations around status symbols, right? Symbols of status, right? We usually talk about status symbols in sort of everyday discussions as if they are always positive and always aspirational. You aspire to have status symbols. But in sociology, we talk about that a little bit more literally, in that they are symbols that indicate a particular status. So if you wanted to talk about, for example, the status of homeless person, you might look at a status symbol of a shopping cart full of one's possessions, right? That's probably not something you're going to aspire to, but sociologically that is still a status symbol. So we can have status symbols in popular culture that might be, for example, particular trends, not necessarily designer clothes, but clothing that is sort of more easily accessible. You can order it off the internet, that kind of thing. We also have elements of non-material culture, which you could talk about in terms of trends, in terms of music one likes, in terms of sort of pop radio, that kind of thing. When we talk about popular culture, I'm going to sort of give you a quick sort of detour into the concept of ideology coming to us from critical theory and sort of conflict theories, which is to say that when we talk about popular culture as an ideology, critical theorists are talking about popular culture, so the stuff that is available largely through things like marketing and movies and sort of the stuff that's really easily accessible and sort of promoted in that way, as communicating an ideology to most people that serves the interest of society's elite. So this is a conversation about how, for example, society's elite, as represented by the owners of multinational corporations and any number of other sort of examples you could put in there, use popular culture to convince the rest of society to go along with ideas that serve them. So advertising in popular culture is a really, really great example of this, because many of you have probably recognized that lots of the things that you are advertised, you don't actually like need in a sort of like physical, I'll die without this kind of sense. But you're deciding to purchase it serves the interest of a capitalist elite. And this is sort of the conflict analysis, in that you, in purchasing this object beyond what you physically need, and need is a whole other conversation we could get into, but beyond what you need, serves the interest of capitalists because it allows them to make more money, right? So there's that kind of piece. There's also some discussion about using popular culture to focus people's attention on certain things, whether that's sort of the sensationalism of celebrity, which we'll get into a little bit in media, and a number of other sort of areas, in order to basically distract people from focusing on things like, hey, our class system really needs to be redefined and we need to sort of tax the rich and do all kinds of other things like that. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about popular culture as an ideology, and it can be really effective in that way. Often, and we'll talk about that piece in substantially more depth when we get to our media chapter, which is chapter 6, module 5. They're out of order for that one. So that's one of the, that's sort of an initial conversation about culture. But the last thing I sort of want to talk about is this idea And your book talks about it as the blending of high and popular culture, and that is sort of a really accurate description. The term we often use in sort of the sociological conversations, if you want to sort of talk about discourse and postmodernism, this is an example of it. When we talk about this in sociology, we're often talking about it as omnivorous cultural consumption, coming from the word for omnivore, i.e. eating both plants and meat, but in this case, for consuming both high culture and popular culture. And this has, in the last sort of 15 or 20 years, often been understood as a conversation about elites consuming both. In the sense that, for example, you will see people who are otherwise associated with the elites consuming pieces of culture that are not typically understood as being markers of elite sort of status. So an example of this would be all of the photographs you have ever seen about any celebrity, especially sort of politicians and people who don't primarily have their status because of their role in entertainment, doing things like sitting courtside at sports games, right? At basketball games, that kind of thing. That sort of marker of people who are otherwise very powerful in society consuming things that are typically understood as popular culture. So this is about, people who are politically and intellectually connected, however you sort of understand that, also getting season tickets to professional sports teams and wanting to go see Beyonce. So there's that kind of omnivorous cultural consumption, and it has sort of been a marker in many ways of access and resources, and that those people who were in the elite could afford to, both in terms of like economic resources, in terms of buying the things and buying the tickets, and in terms of access to time and leisure, were able to consume both. But your book has also sort of raised like another possibility there, in that, especially as streaming video and all kinds of other things like that, including the ones that I'm using to get to you today, are also creating some changes in that. So, for example, now every major orchestra in the world streams most of their concerts or puts their videos up on YouTube or other video platforms. So if what you want to do is consume that kind of media that is traditionally associated with the elites, so classical music, ballet, any of that sort of pieces, you can do so. And you can do so without needing to expend the resources that it would typically require you to get there. And that includes everything from the ticket price to transportation to having the right clothes to be there. Because if you really want to, in like this world that we live in today, most all of you could sit down and be watching the best orchestras and the most talented ballerinas and all of that sort of stuff. Like you could be looking at the most expensive pieces of art in the world from home in your pajamas eating a bowl of potato chips, which is sort of the flip side of omnivorous cultural consumption, right? And the conversation about that is largely about how do we still understand these forms of culture as consumptions that mark status and mark a place in a social hierarchy. And we're going to get into all the stuff about social hierarchies and classifications of people when we get to our unit on inequality, which is module 6. But for now, there's our sort of conversation about omnivorous cultural consumption.